This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello, this is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at some older materials written by Rene Guénon, the perennialist philosopher and practicing mystic himself. Specifically, his earlier ones that were about what he called spiritism and theosophy. Because essentially, a lot of his early works were, really attacking and going after what we would call now the fluffy bunnies of his time. Though I guess people don't use fluffy bunny anymore. I guess the most modern term would be like the witch talkers, right? The crystal girls of his era. Because now we see a lot of people in the esoteric community who go really, really hard on things like the New Age, crystal girls, witch talkers, plastic spirituality, fluffy bunnies. There's a new term for this every year. Like, genuinely, I feel like there's a new buzzword for this all the time. And it's always kind of rotating. And I think it reflects this tension between people who consider themselves more serious practitioners and people who do this as more of a fluffy hobby without a rooting and grounding in more serious metaphysics. In fact, it's so common to knock on these practitioners that about 6 or so years ago it became a whole controversial thing that people were sort of making fun of beginners or being hostile or gatekeeping in a way that is actually negative for the spiritual growth of people around them. I myself am very critical of the fluffy bunny type of practitioners. I have been since I began my work online. And that is because I think these systems lead people astray and misguide them from true mysticism, which I believe is important to promulgate and promote. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at what people in our past were saying about these movements. These texts specifically are from the 1920s or so. They didn't release at the exact same time. The one on the Theosophy is a little bit earlier. In fact, it is one of his earliest published texts ever. But they both really talk about similar things, and I think they relate to some conversations we've been having. So I guess the fun little game of this is, do his critiques hold up? Are we still fighting the things that he was fighting? And what can we glean from the essential New Agers of the past and have some of these ideas that were laughed off as New Age, though the term New Age didn't really exist at this time, does it still hold up? So to connect these things, I want to define theosophy and spiritism first so that people who are not, super versed in the history of esotericism know exactly what movements he was talking about. So theosophy is an older movement. It rose to prominence around the same time as the broader occult or magical revival. I like the term magical revival. Not everyone uses that term, but it's the one that I prefer. There's a really good book by Kenneth Grant called The Magical Revival. It was recently republished. So you can actually get a copy of it, because I know getting any sort of Kenneth Grant book can be quite an endeavor and quite expensive. So it was paperback republished pretty recently. But basically, this period of time, starting in Victorian and going all the way into the Edwardian, there was a massive resurgence of interest in esotericism. Now, why this period of time? I believe specifically it was this period of time because we had just gone through a long period of rationality, and I've noticed that whenever there's big periods of intense dogma around the material sciences and a rejection of things like religion and an embracing of materialism, secularism, and rationalism, there is always a sort of counter reaction of people getting reinterested in the spiritual. At this point in time, we are looking at, the late 18s into the very early 19s. What had happened right before then? Right before then, you saw the Enlightenment and the rise of liberal democracy through things like the French Revolution, which of course paved the way for the American Revolution. And all of these revolutions and movements were centered around things like liberal values and a belief in rationalism and the intellect. All these sort of themes were going all around as well. This was right around the same time ideas like Marxism started gaining more popularity, right? And that is, of course, a very secular materialist world, believing that history is defined by materialism itself and by what happens in the physical, any sort of rejection of the spiritual. So after that, you see this counter reaction of people becoming a lot more religious, because fundamentally the magical revival was a resurgence of truly magical ways of approaching things. It was an interest in seances. The entire concept of a seance comes from this period. It was an interest in Eastern spirituality, where you see this sort of belief, this is really strong in theosophy, that the Western world has kind of abandoned religiosity and esotericism for a much more dogmatic religiosity, because once again, this is around the same time that Protestantism was taking hold, and Protestantism is a much less esoterically grounded form of Christianity. If you look at Orthodoxy or Catholicism, you see a big influence on the saints and, communion being a transmutation and a transfiguration of Jesus into the wafer. Whereas in Protestant Christianity, it was much more about the exoteric, the laws, the rules, and much less mystically oriented. This is why if we look at mystical Christianities or religious occult traditions merging out of Christianity, they almost always come from Catholicism or Orthodoxy. I find Catholicism tends to have the most, though funnily enough, I actually think Orthodoxy is the most mystical in the way it performs liturgy. My favorite Christian rite is Divine Liturgy. I'm more partial to Eastern Orthodoxy, but there are so many mystical movements out of Catholicism, like the Renaissance, occultism. Those were largely Catholics. In South America, where you see traditions like Santeria or, folk Catholicism as a concept, that is once again coming out of Catholicism. But basically, we got this counter reaction. Theosophy was a big driver of this, though Theosophy was not the only movement at the time. And Theosophy fundamentally argued that all religions are coming from the same central point, and they are all different expressions of that. And it specifically took a heavy interest in Eastern esotericism. And by Eastern esotericism, I mean the esotericism of the Vedic traditions and the Buddhist traditions. That is what Madame Blavatsky, or Helena Blavatsky, the sort of creator of Theosophy, the woman who began it, the Slavic woman, was most fascinated by. Then she brought in some original ideas, like the idea of ascended masters, which are essentially past spiritual leaders and influential people who can be channeled and brought into her work. She also invented a different idea of reincarnation. She had an idea called the Akashic Records, which is essentially that there is a place in the astral realm where all this records and history of humanity and our lives are stored. I like to call it the spiritual filing cabinet, though I personally do not believe in the Akashic Records. That is one of her ideas. And so Theosophy was this interesting blend of a lot of things. Now, Spiritism, or as we call it now, spiritualism, I don't really see anyone calling it Spiritism, was a movement at this time that kind of stayed in this time. Spiritualism, in how it was, did kind of die off, which is why I think looking at his thoughts on spiritualism is going to be so interesting. Because what it was I'm sure you've seen the photos, right? There's a lot of these old photos out of this period of time, a lot of early photography in general that was covering these meetings of spiritists in Europe, who would all get together and they would sit around big tables and they would do seances where they would all hold hands and they would call in certain ghost and dead spirits to communicate with them and give them guidance, information, or simply as a sort of parlor trick, right? And out of this, there became a lot of movements that are sort of heirs to spiritualism, but as spiritualism exists, it's not as much a thing. There are some spiritualist organizations today. I know in my city, there's a group that does spiritualism. I've never gone, but I do know it exists. But what was interesting is a lot of spiritualist techniques ended up integrating into other religions. So now if you see a spiritualist church, it's largely an integration of the spiritualism of this period of time into some new religion. Things like charismatic Christianity, I think, take a lot from spiritualism and some other stuff. I think there are heirs to this practice. Now, where does the New Age, which is what we today are most familiar with, comes in? So the New Age is an heir to Theosophy. So out of Theosophy, there became a student named Alice Bailey who would start a movement called New Thought. That was basically just an evolution of Theosophy and what ended up being the predecessor to the New Age. The New Age really entered the collective consciousness with the 60s and the 70s, and then it merged with ideas like psychedelica and free love hippie stuff, and it kind of became what it is today. Now, I actually take a more complicated view of Theosophy than Renee Guénon is going to take of Theosophy. So I generally am pretty negative towards theosophy. I've gone really, really hard on theosophy. But the truth that I will give to theosophy is that without theosophy, a lot of these Eastern spiritual concepts would not be known or understood in the West. As well, I do believe that these movements open people's eyes to mysticism in a way that could be a good thing. But there is so much that has come out of theosophy that I do think is rather toxic. And there is a sort of thing that I want to hit on here, which is, what does Rene Guénon believe? What is his bias? So Rene Guénon was a perennialist. So perennialism is the idea that there is one singular eternal truth that underlies all religions. And what we have discovered through all these religions are revelations that are fundamentally leading us to that underlying current and that underlying truth. And through that we can see what it is, right? No full religion has grasped it all. And now his original idea, and what sort of separates what he thought from theosophy, is he believed the ways to this underlying truth, which fundamentally theosophy also agrees with, is the idea that through finding the most static religious traditions possible, you can reach it. And this is why Rene Guénon would very publicly and openly convert to Islam and become a Sufi, because he believed Islam is the least changing religion. And in a way, there is some truth to that. Now, where I differ from both Blavatsky and Guénon is that I have a slightly different perspective on what I believe Islamic theology is than what Guénon took. I believe Guénon kind of took it on its face a little more than maybe he should have. And I believe with theosophy, she made a lot of connections that were not there. I think Guénon had a much stronger grounding in proper metaphysics than Blavatsky did. But these critiques are all interesting. Now, I'm going to get into what Guénon actually said now that I've done my little introduction. We're going to start with Theosophy, a history of a pseudo-religion. This is not going to be like I'm not just going to be reading everything to you. Obviously, that would be the most boring thing in the world. But I do want to start with just some of what he had to say. Now, he sort of talks about, in his argument, a background with theosophy. I think I've given a decent background of what it is. I don't think I need to go into his really detailed summary of what theosophy's history is. His big argument with this is that Theosophy's history is clearly influenced by other things, and Theosophy clearly has some baggage to it, and there is some weirdness in sort of the conditions in which it began. I don't find that as interesting. I think that where it does get interesting is when he actually starts making his critique. And this is one that I see occultists make towards the New Age constantly. And this is his argument about the power of suggestion. So what he argued is that Blavatsky was actually the smartest of the theosophists, right? There were people who came after Blavatsky. In fact, the successors of Blavatsky created an incredibly rich tradition. They created a huge one. But he believed that the successors to Blavatsky were simply not as intelligent as Blavatsky, and Blavatsky's almost greatest weakness is that she was kind of suggestible, and her not creating a more disciplined reason of telling what is true and what is a real channeled message would end up hurting her, right? And end up setting up her tradition for a lot of frauds. Now, if we look at the modern New Age movement, which are heirs to Theosophy, without a doubt, we see this a lot. I've noticed when people like us look at modern things like witch talk, there's a level of suggestibility that people are bothered by, right? I think about Moldavite. So this was a scandal about 2 years ago. Not a scandal, it was a trend. A trend's a better word, but it became controversial, to say the least. And there was basically what it started around is there's this little green crystal called Moldavite. And Moldavite blew up after this one girl made a video with Moldavite, claiming that Moldavite is like the most powerful crystal ever. It's super strong. And she literally filmed outside a burnt down house and claimed that her house was burnt down because of Moldavite. Now, naturally, everyone who saw that video wanted to know what it was about, and a lot of them ended up going to stores and buying Moldavite. In fact, the people I know who run occult businesses, who run witch shops, right? I knew several at the time, and they told me that Moldavite was always sold out. In fact, I went around at that time. I used to go to occult bookstores a lot. I still do, actually. I don't know why I said used to there, but at that time, I was going to them more than I am now, and I would see Moldavite was either selling for like $200, which is a lot for a crystal, or it was just not there. And now, if I go to like the New Age occult stores near my house, right, it's always there, and it's nowhere near as much as it was. Basically, people were, they were suggested by this, and what became so interesting is people started, trying it and like wearing it around, and they started blaming every single bad thing that happened in their life on the Moldavite, right? Instead of like, having a spiritual experience with the Moldavite and then seeing what happens. So I think he's kind of pointing to that. Because if you become overly suggestible and you're not thinking critically about the mystical experiences that you're having, you are incredibly suggestible. And we know metaphysically that the mind has a ton of power, right? What we think impacts everything about us. Now, there's multiple ways this is defined as a metaphysical concept. Some, like I know, use the term of like mentalism, like the power of the mind itself is able to bend reality. We are always going to be influenced by our mind. You can take a sort of Jungian approach and talk about how our the different powers of the mind, or you could say that it is will itself, right? The metaphysical principle of will is what shapes reality. Magic is just causing change to happen in alignment with the will. And so if you will the Moldavite to ruin your life, then yes, the Moldavite will ruin our lives because of the power of the will that we are able to exert. So I think all of that is sort of a like successor to this idea. Now, the next thing that Gwenon critiques of Blavatsky is her sourcing. He really blames Blavatsky and Theosophy for people's misinformation about ideas like karma and reincarnation. I agree with him wholeheartedly here. I think that the colloquial idea of karma, and that's what I'm going to call it, is a misinterpretation. If we look to the Vedic traditions, karma is something that is acquired throughout our entire life based on the good things and the bad things that we do that accumulate and sort of count up. And then when we reincarnate into the next life that we experience, that is based on our karma in this life. That is the original idea of karma. Now, modern people largely think that karma is I do bad thing, then bad thing happened to me. And that really is exemplified in an idea that would come much later that I believe is an heir to this idea as well, called the Rule of Threes. The Rule of Three is an idea in contemporary Wicca. It was not put in there by Gerald Gardner. It was really put in there by people who I would call eclectic Wiccans, who were very influenced by this poem called The Wiccan Raid, who then interpreted it in a very specific way. But the way they interpreted it is what you do to the world comes back to you times three. And so if you say put evil out into the world or do evil with your mysticism, evil things will happen to you at 3 times the power. Whereas if you do something good, like you wish for good luck or prosperity for your people or growth of, the harvest or whatever, right? That'll come back to you times 3. That is not a Vedic idea on what karma is. It's just objectively not. It is a more Western idea. And I believe that is an heir to Theosophy. And the sources with Blavatsky, and this is really, you see this in any way that Eastern concepts are discussed in the West, right? The reason why they get so upset with things like pop Buddhism and pop Hinduism is because it is only one interpretation of these systems. I think the most obvious example is the chakra system. So when we look at chakras, I think everyone pictures chakras as like, the chakras that all the West knows. Like there's one single way to think about chakras. What's so interesting is there actually not only one way of thinking about chakras in the East. In fact, there's a book, I really like it. It's the Llewellyn Complete Guide to Chakras, and it's so long, it's massive. But basically it shows that there are completely different chakra systems. Some have like 30 plus chakras, some only have a few. And so this idea that there are only the amount that we are used to seeing is false. And a lot of these pop ideas come from the fact that Blavatsky studied a very specific style of Eastern metaphysics that she would bring back to the West. She didn't look at all of it and bring it all back. It was a very specific form of it. And so when we think about like Western pop spirituality, we all understand a very specific form of these things. Like think about meditation, right? When we think about meditation in the West, we think about sitting in silence with your eyes closed. And while that is a legitimate form of meditation, in fact, it's one that's very powerful. And it's not the only way that people have meditated, right? There's a ton of different meditation practices. In fact, you could spend your entire spiritual career studying only meditation and learning the millions of different ways to meditate. So a lot of that does come from this. Now, the next big thing that Gwenon would critique, and just so you guys know, I'm not getting into like the super details of everything he said. I'm just talking about like the general arguments and then extrapolating upon it. We don't have time to get through absolutely everything. He didn't really like, and this actually really wasn't about Blavatsky, this was about one of her successors, Annie Besant. And that would be the way that esoteric Christianity and theosophical Christianity came out of this stuff. So there is a sort of strange form of Christianity that kind of emerges from theosophy and has a lot of these ideas that, you know, are with Christian symbolism, are with Christian themes, but are fundamentally not really what the term esoteric Christianity is, right? This is a good quote. I wanna just kind of read this quote. I didn't think I'd do a lot of reading, but I do like this. But it must not be forgotten in one of his books, Hartman presents Jesus as an initiate, an opinion shared by Eduard Schucker, the inventor of an alleged Hellenic Christian esotericism, whose character is in most suspect, since it is one to judge by the very titles of the works that expounded. It must lead from Sphinx to Christ, then from Christ to Lucifer. Secondly, we will maintain more or less appeared. Anna Kingsford and Edward of Maslin were members of the Theosophical Society. It is true that they withdrew soon afterwards. But basically, what this is going on about is that a lot of these Christian esotericism that came out of theosophy were really not very Christian. And what's interesting is there are Christian esoteric traditions that are syncretic. I think of traditional Hermeticism, which is something that Gwenon goes on a little bit in here, that, you know, theosophy had a very specific version of Hermeticism that emerged out of it, right? It was not the wholeness of Hermeticism. And that is something that he was a little prophetic about, because a little after all of this, there would be a book that would come out called The Kybalion, which I have an entire YouTube video on the Kybalion. And nowadays people say the Kybalion is the source that you should learn about Hermeticism from. Basically what it is, it's a list of like Hermetic principles or like main concepts that they argue are Hermetic, and people literally take this as like gospel, like this is like their religion. And what's interesting about it is, while largely it doesn't contradict the classical Hermeticism that you would see in the Corpus Hermeticum, it is fundamentally a deviation because it's not pulling from that, it's its own thing. And so people have largely pointed out repeatedly that the Corpus Hermeticum, the Kybalion, is something that is clearly from New Thought, from Theosophy. It is not from traditional Hermeticism. And what we're getting at here is that she would take, and Theosophy takes, older religions and then permutates them and creates something entirely new that doesn't really, you know, come back to that religion. And I'm not saying that, you know, making original takes or heresy are bad. I'm a heretic myself. But you shouldn't allege that it is sort of the trueness of the thing. Now, the next thing he critiques, well, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, I'm not reading every single critique he made, we would be here all night, is this messianic undertone to theosophy that, I mean, nobody really talks about this, and I see this a little bit in some neo-spiritualist traditions, including my favorite tradition to knock on, the Starseeds. I think Starseed stuff is very stupid. But I think the starseed craziness takes root in this idea. So Theosophists had a messianic current to them, but in its own way. Specifically, if you ever heard the term like Christ consciousness, this all relates to that. Basically, what Theosophists believed, that there was a sort of great teacher or world teacher. These terms came from specific like Sanskrit terms. Basically, they believed that there was this like one true teacher, great teacher who would, you know, enlighten the world. Some of these people like cited Christ consciousness or Jesus is that, which if you think about Christ consciousness as a concept, it's a New Age concept of like Jesus Christ not as a Messiah and incarnation of God, but as like a guiding light or teacher. I guess the oldest rooting of this in proper metaphysics would be the Kabbalistic attribution of Jesus to Tiferet. Tiferet being this very solar spear that is obviously got like enlightening type connotations to it. Basically, they have this messianic concept of the great teachers, and this actually comes out with their idea that I mentioned a little earlier of the ascended masters, right? um Constantly theosophy cites the ascended masters, which are these dead great spiritual leaders, kind of like what people talk about when they talk about like Buddhas, right? That can guide you or enlighten you through communicating with them. And this messianic thing, it underlies a lot of original theosophy really, really strongly. And, that spirit kind of went away as theosophy evolved into things like New Thought and then the New Age. Like, largely the New Age movement, when we think about the large one in the like 60s, 70s, was not very messianic in nature, right? It was more about like a messianic age, right? A age of peace, an age of greatness, an age of like a return to truth away from the constricting and restrictive norms that they thought that the 50s, 40s, and 30s were, right? Into this sort of new era, using things like psychedelics or free love or whatever it was that people were fixated on as sort of the gateway into that, right? And that was their messianism, right? It was, we will make the world better, we will fix the world through, the things that went along with the New Age, the hippie movement, whatever, right? Not endorsing all the hippie movement. I'm actually pretty critical of the hippie movement. I can do another podcast where I get into why, as an esotericist, I don't like the hippie movement. I guess I can do it quickly. I think that a lot of hedonism started blinding people from religion, right? Because when we think about the concept of sin or vice, I heard this. This was someone else on my podcast defined this for me, and it was something that I've repeated so many times. Sin and vice are things that prioritize the material over the spiritual, right? Because we should not be living for the material world. We should be living for something higher. A thought that I had recently was the idea of living as an atheist instead of living as a religious person, right? When you are living as an atheist, it doesn't matter what you believe because you are taking the lifestyle on as an atheist. You are not living the principles that you claim. You are not living the mystical ideas that you are talking about. You are not living your religion. You are not living in accordance to that divine law. You are living in accordance to that material law that is always going to be changing according to the times, right? And so with the hippies, you see people having this spiritual awakening, but it is an awakening that is tampered by these people's preconceptions and preconceived notions because the hippie movement went so far in line with specific political ideologies and philosophical ideologies that it blocked them from the metaphysics of what they were looking at. And there are a number of big esoteric teachers that I think struggle with this to some extent. I'll be a little critical about a system that I used to be heavily involved with that I'm less involved with now, and that would be Thelema, right? I think Aleister Crowley as a person was largely blinded by his own precognitions to the point where it messed up his metaphysical practice. Most infamously, he did not complete the Abramelin ritual because he simply could not do it. So he created a new ritual, Liber Samekh, to get the same result. And fundamentally, Liber Samekh, it is a path to the Holy Guardian Angel, as so is the Abramelin ritual. Liber Samekh is essentially a almost Shabbataian type, I will transgress so far that eventually, like, God will just take mercy on me. And so I don't like Liber Samekh. I think it's not a good way to approach things. I don't like the ritual itself either. I think the Abramelin is better, and I think the best of these rituals is, of course, the headless and the bornless ritual. They are just so much better. Anyways, off my little tangent, we see, this idea of, like, the messianic time, the messianic period. And now we see movements starting in like the 80s and 90s of the star seed movement that I would say is the most messianic of the New Age strains, but it sort of perverts the idea of messianism into a self messianism. Basically, and I hate even talking about this and giving it any credibility at all. It's a UFO cult. It began with a UFO cult. But basically, what it is it's this idea that there's a lot of people who are star seeds where their soul is from another planet that has incarnated onto this earth in order to save this earth, right? Like they are from another planet and they've incarnated on this planet to fix the world and raise it to a higher definition, higher dimension, higher plane of being. And when you think about what that would mean, how do you raise the world to a higher dimension? How does that work? And then you look at what the starseeds actually talk about. And like, I remember they were saying like the coronavirus was a 5D ascension. I'm sure they'll start saying this about the current Israel-Palestine war, like it's like a way of ascension. They say this basically anytime there's any sort of like global chaos or panic or whatever, right? It's a portal to something higher, and obviously that's not true. But it's this extreme messianism because anyone who believes they are a star seed fundamentally believes that they are a Messiah, right? Right? They're no longer placing the Messiah role onto this vague Christianity that Theosophy sort of poked at, or onto like a messianic age of sorts that we will be guided to by whatever it is, like the hippies did. It's like, I am now the Messiah. And that is, of course, a very egotistical way to look at religion, right? We generally think that the ego is supposed to be dissolved a bit. Of course, it is impossible to be alive and fully kill your ego, which is why I am so critical of the term ego death. I don't like it. But the goal is, of course, to tamper your ego, right? And eventually, when we leave this plane, annihilate into the divine. A Sufi explained this really, really well with the phrase, I am God. And I think this applies well to the Starseed thing. So when you say the phrase, I am God, you mean one of two things, right? You either mean, I am literally a God, I am a divine being who is, making this world, right? Something very much like the Starseeds are saying, right? The Starseeds are arguing, I am God. But you can also say, I am God in a different way. And this is the way that the Sufis said it. When you say, I am God, you are fundamentally submitting yourself to the divine in the most extreme way possible, because you are denying that you have a selfhood outside of the formlessness and the endlessness of God. All is God, we are God. And it is a statement of annihilation, a statement of submission, a statement of giving in. I am God because there is nothing separate from me, there is no separation. So these two ways of saying I am God means something entirely different. And obviously Blavatsky did not intend for a weird UFO cult of people who think that they are like, alien beings to happen. Like, that's not what she was getting at. That's but it does come from this, right? When you have a messianism that isn't like rooted in anything, that isn't productive, that isn't, I don't know, it gets complicated. I personally have a weird relationship to the idea of a messiah in general. I have a pretty non-messianic spirituality, but if you're gonna believe in messianic stuff, you're gonna be messianic. You have to believe in messianism in a way that actually leads to something positive and actually allows people to have a gateway to grow, or to be saved by something, or to be fixed by something, or for the world to be repaired in some way. Now I'm going to move to his other stuff. I'm going to move away from the Theosophy stuff because we're about at the midpoint of the show, into his writing about spiritism. The word spiritism bothers me. I'm going to call it spiritualism for the rest of the show, because nowadays we call this stuff spiritualism. I don't really hear many people say the word spiritism as well. Rene Guénon wrote all of this in French. It is translated to English. So I'm you know what I mean? I don't feel any qualms in just saying spiritualism, because people know more what I'm talking about now. If I quote him, I'll say spiritist, because that's the word that he's using, but we're talking about the same thing. Now, he begins with a sort of background on it, a history. Basically, spiritualism as a movement did come from actual esoteric groups, which is what's so interesting to me, because that was something I didn't even know until I started looking at Rene Guénon's critique. Basically, what he talks about is how spiritualism is a descendant of a specific Hermetic brotherhood, that basically like grew out of it and became something huge, which is so interesting to me, because when we look at all these pop metaphysics movements, a lot of them actually do grow from real metaphysics. I think specifically of a couple years ago, in like 2020, there was a big like witchcraft craze, right? It was a witch talk. And it was a huge movement at the time. It ended up getting like so many views, more views than like the president at the time. It was huge. Like, I know people always think it's kind of silly when I start talking about witch talk in a sort of historical way, or in a, serious manner, but I think it should be addressed in a serious manner because of the sheer magnitude that it was. It was huge. There were so many people who were involved in witch talk. I myself was around during this period of time. While I did not agree with witch talk ideology, I was still a mystic, though I had a slightly different perspective than I have now. I saw this grow and boom, and like normal people were talking about it. Bookstores, their mind, body, spirit section, which is where all the occult books grow, were sprawling. It was everywhere. It was unescapable. There was even like dramas on witch talk that made it into like serious newspapers, right? It was a big phenomenon, and a lot of people got sucked into this moment in time. To be honest, it was a very exciting moment of time. I remember thinking that like the esoteric phenomenon was only going to grow, that perhaps it would become one of the major religions. And actually, in certain countries during this period of time, things like paganism became the fastest growing religion in their country. Like it was big. And now, even afterwards, right, this moment has passed. It's 2023. Well, it's actually the end of 2023. It's going to be 2024 in a couple months. We're about 4 years, almost 4 years ahead of it, right? And we've noticed that yeah, this trend has died off. A lot of people have left, but there were more people involved in this stuff and more of an interest with this stuff than there was before this period of time. But that movement, it was largely ridiculed by people like me. I was very harsh on witch talk. I made jokes about it. I did like, you know what I mean? I was super harsh about it. I actually started my first podcast ever as a counter reaction to it because I thought there was a lot of spiritual misinformation flowing around and that I thought could seriously misguide or even hurt practitioners, right? But even this movement, where does witch talk come from? Witch talk is a sort of blend of several traditions. It's got a theosophical influence and it's got a major Wicca influence. And Wicca, as it began, actually does come from old school occultism, which people always forget. Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca, he had an experience with these group of women that he called the New Forest Coven, who he claimed initiated her into a classic never ending surviving form of Celtic paganism that he believed survived before the conversion. This was largely inspired by Margaret Murray, at the time accepted but now discredited historian who talked about this idea of the witch cult of Western Europe, or this idea that there have been surviving witch cults and cells that have existed since the conversion. The ironic thing about Margaret Murray and her historicism is that if it is true, it fundamentally rewrites European history. And the darker implication of it is if she's correct and there was a surviving witch cult, it would, in the minds of, Catholic authorities, justify the witch hunts, right? It would mean that, yes, there were real witches that they were hunting in Europe when they committed atrocities against the population by burning women alive, right? So it does justify certain things. Largely now it is considered historical revisionism, but there are still people who truly believe in Margaret Murray's historicism. She also came up with the idea of the burning times, which is sort of rewrite of the witch trial in Europe's history into being a persecution of women, midwives, healers, right? Instead of being a sort of collective psychosis moment of mass hysteria. So completely different view of history, but that is largely a big part of what led to Wicca. But if we look at the other thing that led to Wicca, and that would be the esoteric background of Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was a member of the Ordo Templi Orientis, which was a Thelemic organization, though it was not started by Thelemites. It was started by a breakoff of German Freemasonry who wanted to incorporate women, and so they were actually sort of kicked out of Freemasonry. And of course, that leads us further back. A lot of people who are in OTO have claimed a lineage to the Knights Templar, which was a organization during the Crusades. There is a sort of esoteric retelling of history that I don't really consider historical revisionism, because there is actually a pretty solid historical case to be made for this based on certain recordings of Knights Templars' confessions in church, amongst other evidences that the Knights Templar had a secret Gnostic belief set to them. They were a Gnostic magical order, and that they interacted with a group of Shia esotericists called the Order of the Assassins, which we do know was a real Islamicate occult organization. They committed a lot of violence, so keep that in mind. This was, the Templar committed violence, the Assassins committed violence, but there's a pretty good historic case to say that these people were doing esotericism. They did interact. So when you look at the lineage of witch talk, it actually does go back to old school esotericism, and obviously, Knights Templar goes back to Gnosticism, and then the Assassins go back to like classical Sufism. So it's interesting to see that all of these movements do come from something, right? There is no religious tradition that pulls off that there is no religious tradition that does not pull from what came before it. And we see that a lot with this stuff. Now, what's interesting to hear is once again, we see this citing of German Freemasonry that Renee Guénon brings up in The Modern Character of Spiritism, which is one of the essays within this, that basically talks about like the religion of this stuff. And he marks that, yes, this largely comes from a German form of Freemasonry. It seems a lot of these esoteric movements kind of do come from that form of Freemasonry specifically. Now, another point he makes, and this is something that I'm just going to read because it is a good point, and I think that it's something that a lot of people who are following these type of traditions need to listen to. And I quote, "Basically, all these people live with a contradiction of which they are unaware, and it passes unnoticed. It is because intelligence plays only a modest part of their convictions. This is why their essentially sentimental theories do not merit the name of doctrine, and if they are attached to them, it is primarily because they find them consoling, and because they are suited to satisfy the aspirations of a vague religiosity." Now, what he means by this is that a lot of people who are part of things like spiritualism, and now, I mean, this point holds up. I see this point in Witch Talk. I see this point in the New Age. I see this point in all of these groups. I see this point in even like the light worker people, right? They have a spiritual nature to them, but they do not have it fleshed out enough to have a doctrine. I know a lot of people who are involved with things find the word doctrine really uncomfortable. Specifically, that's why I believe the phrase "I'm spiritual but not religious" has such popularity, right? People who are like, well, I'm like into beliefs. I believe in things. I believe there is more to this world, but I would never call myself religious. I don't like the term religion. And that is because there is a rejection of doctrine. Now, in a sense, I kind of get why people reject doctrine, right? I think that there are some groups, and Gwen would agree, that rely so heavily on doctrine that they lack spirituality. I specifically think of certain dogmatic Christian organizations, right? They've, always repressed heresy. They don't allow individual thought. And some, especially if you look at Protestantism, actually punish people for being religious, right? Renee Guénon actually almost got put on the Catholic Church list of banned books because he does highly advise people to get into mysticism. Mysticism is the base of his beliefs, right? Like, he did consider himself a Muslim, but he also wrote about other traditions, and he fundamentally was a perennialist at the end of the day. But he valued doctrine very, very highly. He believed that the esoteric needs the exoteric. In fact, he wrote about this in, I believe it is Introduction to the Hindu Doctrines. I don't have that one in front of me, so I can't quote if that's the exact one it's from, but he has this little subsection called esoteric versus exoteric, which is a concept that I've pushed very heavily. I really believe in this idea, and is that religion has two natures: the exoteric, which is the doctrine, the dogma, the things you hold in church, and the esoteric, the spiritual, the stuff that happens when you pray or take communion, the deep metaphysical side of things, and the personal experience. And he's basically saying that these traditions rely so heavily on the esoteric, they lack the exoteric, which I'm sure he would make the other case for other movements. One, since he's from Islam, that I think fits this, the reverse problem would be Salafism, right? Salafism is something that Guénon was not part of. Salafism is a specific modernist, funnily enough, it's a reform movement. Though when we talk about reform in Islam, often reform means something more fundamentalist, whereas the older forms of Islam often are more mixed in with the culture or whatever. And basically what Salafism argued is that all of Islam had fallen into a state of jahiliyyah, right? A state of ignorance, an age of ignorance, which is basically what the pre-Islamic polytheists were. And so what they believed is that you needed to eradicate anything that could vaguely recognize or be resembled from pre-Islamic paganism. The thing is, that's impossible because Islam has a heavy influence from pre-Islamic paganism. And this is one of my things where Guénon actually start to disagree with him, because Guénon sees Islam as a fully rooted part of the Abrahamic tradition, instead of noting that Islam has such heavy pre-Islamic influences, such gaps from the other Abrahamic traditions, that it cannot be seen as anything other than a continuation of what came before it. The only Salafi writer who I do think has some interesting thoughts is Sheikh al-Albani, who is a Salafi thinker, but he has actually been condemned by the other Salafis for not being true enough to source or whatever. But fundamentally, he took this idea of let's not innovate, ever from what the original Muslims were doing to the fullest conclusion, to where he actually thought that even the ritual prayer that Muslims do today, 5 times a day, Salah, might not be exactly what originally was done. Thus, even Salah, one of the greatest rootings of Muslim prayer, is fundamentally an innovation. So Albani, totally worth reading. The other Salafists were just so extreme that they actually condemned all forms of mysticism. They condemned the Sufis. And Salafism has had an incredibly negative impact on the broader world. I think it's done a lot of damage. Geopolitically, has certainly done a lot of damage. But you see, like, you need both. And, Guénon valued mysticism, and he also valued doctrine. You don't need to choose. In fact, I think everyone is both spiritual and both religious, because if you lack an esoteric or an exoteric, you're going to run into problems, because fundamentally your spirituality is going to be incomplete. And that is actually where I agree with him on spiritualism. I think spiritualism as a movement, specifically the spiritualism he's talking about here, is an incomplete system. I think a lot of actually new religious movements are incomplete systems. There's something that has started somewhere. Like, I do believe spiritualist practices will do something, and Guénon actually isn't denying this. He says at various points that things like some of the theosophical revelations were frauds or hoaxes, which perhaps that is true. There are some things I've read channeled from theosophists that I think could be fake. And then some of these spiritualist things he thinks are fake. But I mean, even if this stuff works, right? Something working doesn't mean it's a full system. And perhaps if something works, we should consider the metaphysical ramifications of it. Like, what does it lead to? What does it start us on? Now, the next thing, and this is where I'm really, really going to deviate from Guénon and get a little annoyed with him, is he has this essay within this text called Spiritism and Occultism. And he lumps spiritualism in with the idea of occultism. He claims that occultism is a new idea, something that comes out of, theosophy. And he claims that occultism is incoherent and not the same as traditional initiatory schools. I disagree with that, because fundamentally, occultism is just the hidden side of things. I think the term occultism can largely be used interchangeably with things like mysticism. If you guys notice, I use it interchangeably. I think his flaw here is he is identifying occultism as the same thing as what occultist movements in his time were doing. But occultism is as broad as the term mysticism, so to lump it all together is just silly to me. It's overzealous, and he ignores the occult histories before these movements that were happening at this time, right? Like, to say like things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn are the genesis of occultism is crazy, right? Things like the Solomonic traditions, the grimoires, those are all occultism, and he completely ignores this. Now, he gets into one interesting critique of spiritualism and occultism that was happening this time that I almost actually agree with him on. And that is the fixation of scientifically justifying the metaphysics. This is most extreme in the idea of scientific illuminism, which is a big part of Thelema, specifically the order AA. It's the method of science, the aim of religion, and it's this idea that we can prove what is true based on doing rituals repeatedly and sort of using the scientific method to discover the truth about religion. Now, I don't think that can work, because fundamentally the scientific method is too quantitative for this to work. It's too fixated on numbers. There actually have been studies into occultism. The CIA did a big study into remote viewing and astral projection. But the thing is, they essentially proved it was true, but they had to mark it as inconclusive because they just can't get the right type of data. So he's kind of right here, because there is and I think this happens with any new movement, right? Movements are impacted by the sort of thought of the time, right? At that time when the magical revival was happening, there was a big fixation on rationalism and science and, things like this. So I think it's logical that the esotericists of the time sort of fell into this. This is like how the New Age of the 70s, right? All those people fell in with like hippie philosophy, because hippie philosophy was so huge. Guénon is very critical of this, because Guénon does not like rationalism. He does not like the sort of things that he thinks are modern. He believes in what he calls like traditionalist or traditional thinking, which is a rejection of this sort of overly modern way of thinking, this you know what I mean? It's just he rejects all of that. He doesn't like that on a philosophical level, because he does believe there's an undercurrent philosophically into these traditions that, while of course they are a counter reaction to the over rationalism, at the same time the over rationalism permeates into them. Right? Like, even though they're trying to not, fall in line with the atheist secular rationalism, like specifically deism was having a moment at this time. This is the idea that like a god created the universe and then let it be and left it alone, like stuff like that. Like the esoteric magical revival people are rejecting, but he thinks fundamentally they're still tainted by it. And I think that's a critique that you can actually throw back on Gwenon a little bit. There's one Christian guy, I don't remember his name, but he made a video about Gwenon, and he called Gwenon in some points hypocritical. Because while Gwenon was writing during the Magical Revival, he is historically part of the Magical Revival timeline-wise, even though he would probably get mad about that, but he is. He, while rejecting all this stuff, still is a little influenced by it. He just doesn't want to admit it. Like, there is a little bit of theosophy in Gwenon, and some have argued, since he called himself a perennialist, in a sense, he just thinks he's the true theosophy. He rejects all theosophy except his theosophy. And I think that might be a little bit true. And that's something that I'm self aware about that Gwenon doesn't really get. Like, I know I am on some level, and I'm pretty open about it. I'm influenced by modern esotericism, right? I'm influenced heavily by modern Western occultism because that is the magic, the metaphysics of this period in time, right? We are living in, the current times, le current time, right? I'm gonna be colored by le current time because I grew up in le current time. I'm also colored by the Anglo-American project because I'm from the United States, right? Of course, I reject a lot of these ideas, right? I reject the New Age. I reject a lot of, certain modernist ideologies that I don't like, postmodern ideology that I don't like. But to deny that I am influenced by them is a little not true and a little egotistical, right? Like, I can't deny that, right? I can't deny that since I started now, like, there's some like witch talky new agey ideas that I, kind of align with. There's certain practices from it that I do, right? Like, I'm okay with that. That's just the truth. While I believe I am distinct from these movements, I don't think I am part of them. To deny that that hasn't, impacted how I see things is just not true, and that can't be true because I am part of this time. I was born during this era, right? I'm a zoomer, right? I'm always going to be a zoomer. These things will always impact me because everyone's influenced by the stuff they are exposed to. Like, even people, this happens in all philosophy schools. They think they're so separate by it, but they're really just not. So yeah, I think he's missing something there. I think that's probably the biggest error of Gwenon, and I think it's the easiest thing to critique him on, is like he's hypocritical in this way because while he's not a theosophist, perennialism, theosophy, and the Magical Revival all had similar aims, right? All of these groups of people were trying to find the truth by smashing different religions together. They were all syncretic. They were all almost perennialistic. They just were doing it in a different way, and they went about it differently, and they used different techniques. But they're not as different as I think Gwenon sometimes thinks they are. And what's so funny about this is all the people who are the hardest on these movements now are people like me, right? People like me who are obviously somewhat influenced by them, right? I have similar aims to some of these like witch talk new age people, right? I want gnosis. I want the great work. I want to annihilate myself under the divine. That's my goal. That's the goal of a lot of these other people too. I just think they're doing it wrong. I think they're doing it in a way that is harmful and blocking them from completing that, right? And that's why I'm always going to be a little softer on these people than I think Gwenon is. I go hard on the practice. I don't go hard on the people, right? Because I think a lot of these people who are in these movements, they're doing the same thing we are. Now, Gwenon goes into like a long theory about why spiritualism works and like different ideas of spiritualism. A lot of them haven't held. Like, he talks about like the fluids that were released during these things, like ectoplasm. That's what we call it now. I agree with him on that. I'm not going to really argue with that. That's fine. And then he talks about how there's like different spiritualist schools. Yeah, that's true. There's different new age schools. There's going to be different schools of absolutely everything. Yeah, I mean, everything has different schools. People will never claim that they again, now the most interesting thing he gets into in this thing is what does it mean for metaphysics if we can talk to the dead, right? If we can summon and do seances with dead people, that has to have broader metaphysical explanations. There has to be some reason why that works, right? Like, let's say you believe in like reincarnation where your soul fully reincarnates. If you believe in reincarnation, how can you believe we talk to the dead unless you believe there's like a liminal gap time, or like you can like invoke a human or something weird? These are all good questions to ask, and these are questions that I've actually never really had explained to me well by a spiritualist. I don't do proper spiritualism. I do ancestor work, which does work with the dead, but I don't ever invoke the dead. I don't channel the dead. But I do think if you can, that has to mean that there's more an afterlife type thing than a reincarnation. My general view on reincarnation in the afterlife is a little complicated. You can read, I wrote a recent Substack article on why I think afterlife and reincarnation are not entirely contradictory phenomenon. It's on my Substack. It's long. It actually talks about some of these ideas. But yeah, it has to have spiritual ramifications. And I think that, I see this today with like witch talk new agers. Like they'll say like, oh, you can manifest, but they don't explain why you can manifest. That's actually why I was originally drawn towards like Victorian era occultism, which is ironically what he's claiming doesn't have good explanations, because it explained it more than like what modern like esotericism is. Like I feel like crystal stuff, like no one explains why the crystals work. They just say like they do. No one explains why like Ouija boards work. They just say they do. No one explains why tarot works. They just say they do. And so for me, when I got into this stuff, I needed an explanation. I needed a theological backing. And I think anyone who stays with this stuff long enough is going to seek that out. So he's on the ball with that. The last critique of his that I want to give some air to is his point about the limits of experimentation. And that is that there is no way to fully do experiments that can 100% prove religious phenomenon. And that trying to experiment with things will hit limits, right? I agree with this. I think the best argument, this was made by Crowley, someone who Gwenon probably would not have liked. I can assume you would not have liked him. Maybe he's written about him somewhere. I haven't read literally every single thing Gwenon has ever written. I've read a lot. Said that success be thy proof, right? The one way to convince someone fully of religion and that religion is true and that all this stuff is real is to have them actually do it and be successful at it. I say this to people. Someone will be like, well, I don't want to do this stuff unless I know it's real. And I'm like, well, how can I convince you it's real if you haven't done it? Because I can argue with you logically. I can explain my metaphysical theories. I can explain emanation. I can explain perennialism. I can explain formulas of ritual. I can explain like the LBRP, why it has these different directions based on certain numerological stuff. Like I can do that, but that's never going to convince someone that something is true. And this is something that Gwenon didn't get at, and this is my own opinion and extrapolation, is humans are fundamentally irrational creatures. We are not, you know what I mean? We're not rational. Like I think everyone who assumes, facts don't care about your feelings are wrong. Feelings don't care about your facts. The only way to convince someone of a religion is for them to have a religious experience themselves. So my answer to everyone, if they want a proof to this, is try it. Try it, see what happens, and then if it works, it works. So that's all I have to say on this one. He goes on a little longer on both of these. The two books that I am citing, if you want to read them in full, is The Spiritist Fallacy and Theosophy, History of a Pseudo-Religion. These are both by Renee Gwenon. You can find, copies. So the different translations, some are public domain and some are not. If they're not public domain, the publisher is Sophia Perennis, who has it all. They've translated all of it, but there are some public domain translations. And if you read French, both of these should be in public domain, so you should be able to read those online if you're a French reader. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys. I hope this has given you some insight. I might talk more about Gwenon in the future. This is my first time really addressing him on the channel. I've talked about him on Twitter and stuff, but never in a whole podcast. So I hope this gives some insight into him. He had original metaphysical ideas, which I'll get at in the future, but I just thought these critiques were really interesting, and I wanted to see if they hold up. So I guess my overall final thought is, do his critiques hold up? And my answer is largely yes, but with some flaws, as are most thinkers. I think you can like a thinker and not wholly agree with them on everything, which is an idea that is kind of lost on the current times. So if you like this podcast, please, if you're on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe. If you're on a podcasting platform, leave a review. If you want to support this podcast, you can join our Patreon. If you join our Patreon, you get all the episodes early. I release them. I mean, it's really anywhere between 24 hours to like 2 weeks early. It really depends on when I, record these. And when I have time to edit. They don't come out at the exact same time, but they all come out on like the platforms that they get posted on every other Wednesday. You also get a bonus podcast every Neo-Pagan Sabbath. So that's 8 times a year. You get a little bonus episode that are all solo. I don't have guests on for my bonus episodes. And as well, you get a pre-show episode, which are basically like mini podcasts that I release every week. They are, well, not every week, excuse me, every episode. Sorry, I misspoke there. It's not literally every week. It's basically just about like, what am I thinking about, what's on my mind, all that stuff. And if you're high enough to get your name read off every single week, so thank you to Charlotte Dickin for your continued support. As well, I am on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, Substack, and a Patreon for my other work. So I'm literally everywhere. I've been writing articles for some magazines as well. I've started doing kind of like writing for other things, sometimes about religion, sometimes about more cultural stuff. So if you follow me on Twitter and Telegram, you'll get updates on all of my like publications that are coming out. I'm trying to get more work out, and I can only hint at this. I can't say anything, but something related to Gwenon might be coming soon. All right. See you guys in the next one, and bye.